Hi, everybody, and welcome to episode 11 of the Unhitching Act, how the law works when your relationship doesn't. My name is Reed Aronson. I'm a matrimonial lawyer here in Manhattan.
And I'm Vanessa Aronson. I am his wife, and I am not a lawyer, matrimonial or otherwise.
And the purpose of the show is to educate people about how family law, matrimonial law, divorce law works, so that if they are having a life event or a friend of theirs or a family member, maybe they could help give them a little bit of guidance, help understand the process a little bit better, and know how to what their rights are and maybe what their obligations are. And that's the point of it. We, in addition to being on Facebook Live, we are also on YouTube, on Hitching Our YouTube channel. So please go check that out if you've missed any episode or any part of an episode, or just want to watch a rerun.
You can watch all 11 at this point.
Well, only 10.
10
Only
plus
10.
the 11th one.
Plus the 11th one eventually will be on there too. So please go head over there if you have some time. Give us a subscribe, give us a like on the videos. It helps spread the channel. And again, thank you for joining us. So today's topic is something of a multi-parter. Last week, we spoke about income and how that's calculated and how it's figured out for the purposes of support, imputed income. So the question is, once you've got income, once you've figured out what the income is, how do you then go and calculate what the support obligation is? And today we're going to talk about that more nuts and bolts kind of fashion. So how do you calculate child support? How do you figure out what the number should be and who should be paying who?
This is a topic that if you're not interested in it, you can blame me, because I've been bugging him about this. I'm like, I don't understand how this is even calculated.
So this is
starting from square one.
You start starting from square one. So we'll not square one because we're figuring out the income. So assuming we know what the people's income is, how does that then translate into a number that one person or the other is going to pay?
Okay.
And that's what we're going to talk about. And for those of you who haven't joined us before, the way that this goes is I'm going to show you a case. This week, normally it's a real case. This week it's not. It's a hypothetical because I wanted to make the numbers clean and easy. So we will show a case. We're gonna ask Vanessa to provide what she thinks should happen in that case, using not necessarily the law because she's not a lawyer, but her understanding of fairness and fair play and common sense and those sorts of things. And we'll discuss it a little bit, and then I'll expand a little bit upon what we've learned, and maybe by the end of the day, we'll all have a better understanding of how child support works.
Great.
All right. So why don't we start with today's case? And again, today's case is a hypothetical, but as a hypothetical, it'll help give a nice, easy baseline. And from there, we'll work and we'll add maybe some changes and some little wrinkles here and there and see how that would affect what we're going to do. So let's share the screen. Optimize. Here we go.
This week we're talking about Child Support 101. This week's case, Connie is married to Paul. They have 2 kids together, and they're getting divorced. Connie makes $100,000 a year as a contractor. Paul makes $50,000 a year as a painter. The 2 have already entered into a custody agreement where the children are with Connie 51% of the time and with Paul 49% of the time. Both of them think they should get child support. Paul argues, I need the money more. I make $50,000 a year less than Connie, and I need to pay for the kids' housing and food. Connie argues, wait a minute. The kids live with me most of the time. So who gets the child support?
So that is our facts. Those are our facts. We've got 2 parents with 2 kids. Connie, the contractor, makes $100,000 a year. Paul, the painter, makes $50,000 a year. Connie thinks that she should get child support from him because she has the kids the slight majority of the time. Paul thinks that he should get child support because he needs the money more, right? The kids are still going to have to live somewhere. The kids are still going to have to eat when they're with him. And given that he has the less money, he should be getting support from her. Who do you think is right?
Okay. So I'm trying to think about when they were married, what this would have looked like. Presumably, they would have had joint accounts, maybe. And, just to keep things simple, I realize that this isn't exactly how it works, but, $100,000 from Connie would go into the joint account and $50,000 would go from Paul into an account that would be $150,000 together that they would have to spend on their family expenses. And therefore, I would then divide that by, half, so 51%. Would be, 75,000 something. And, and 49% would be 74,000 something. So therefore, the 75,000 would be Connie's share and the 74,000 something would be Paul's share. Therefore, I think that probably Connie needs to pay Paul a little bit of child support.
Okay.
Now, I realize you don't spend 100% of your income on anything, hopefully, on your children, but I would still think that that's sort of like proportional money that you put into the pot and then proportional to how much time you have with the kids is sort of how I would do it.
So in New York, and this is going to be different for different states, but in New York, Paul cannot get child support.
Really? Why?
Yes, the law in New York is very clear and very explicit. Unless you have 50.1% of the time,
wow,
you are not entitled to child support, but from a judge. Now, you can always make a settlement, an agreement, and do things a little differently. But if you go to a judge and a judge is deciding it, you cannot get child support unless you have 50.1% or more of the time.
Wow.
So Paul, even if he has nothing, now he might get spousal support, but for child support, unless you have more than 50% of the time, or 50% of the time or more, you cannot get child support.
Okay, yeah, can we go back to what you just said, 50% or more? What if their custody agreement had been 50-50?
So it's almost impossible for it to be exactly 50-50, right? Because you're going to have weird holidays and you're going to have Mother's Day and Father's Day and things. And
you can't just do it year by year.
If
you get these 365.
So I'm not sure that there has ever been a case that has been exactly 50-50. But if there were a case that were exactly 50-50, there's not necessarily a bar to one parent paying the other. But if you definitely have, and that's our hypothetical here, 49%, no matter what the financial circumstances are, you cannot get child support.
Wow, I had no idea.
Okay.
So
with that in mind, so we know that Paul. So if there's anybody paying anybody,
it would be Paul.
Paul is going to be paying Connie, and then the question is how much. And I'm not going to make you answer that question. In New York and in many states, there's a formula. There's guidelines for how much child support should be paid, and it's based on income. And in New York, here's how the formula looks. So you take the combined income. So in this case, you take the combined income, you multiply it by a percentage that's set forth in a chart based on the number of children, and then you compare that to the pro rata share of total income for that parent. All right?
Can you tell us what pro rata share is?
So I'll explain it. So in this case, the combined income is $150,000, right? Because Paul makes 50, Connie makes 100, that's a total of 150. That's the combined number. They have two kids. So if you look at the chart, right, they're here, which is 25%. Mm-hmm. So you take 150 times 100 times 25%, and then you multiply that by Paul's pro rata share of the total income.
All right, so let's do that. So what's 25% of 150 is 32,500.
Sure.
I think, right? 32,500, because it's 75,000 would be
Yeah, I mean, but the advantage of multiplication is that it's commutative, so you can always do the one that's a little easier.
All right, never mind.
And in this case, it's a third, right?
Okay.
Because there's $150,000 in combined. He makes 50, so a third of the total amount of income is attributable to him.
Okay.
So you multiply those numbers together, and what you get is $12,500 a year, or $1,041 a month and 66 cents, right, per month, and that's the formula. And in every case where the formula applies, and that's every case, the judge is going to go through these motions and going to go through this exercise and add these numbers up and come out with that number. Now, some of you who are good at math may be asking, why do we need the extra step up here? Why can't we just multiply his income times this percentage? Because that's the number you would end up with. And there's a reason for that we're going to get to, but this is the way that you do it. You do it in this fashion. All
right, can you put it a little closer to the camera? And in my defense, I'm looking at it backwards. So that's why I couldn't see.
All right. So that's how that number is calculated. Now we're going to get to a number of ways that a judge can go up or down from that number, or reasons why they might. But for the as a starting point, this is always where the analysis starts.
Okay.
So let me ask you let me change the hypothetical a little bit. What if Paul makes $100,000 too? So Paul the painter makes $100,000. Connie the contractor makes $100,000. How does this change the calculation? All right. So if you just put it through the machine, right, so the same formula, what you would get would be something that would look kind of like this.
Again, I think.
Sorry. So kind of like this. So you'd have $200,000 in combined income. 25% stays the same because there's still two kids. And then he'd now be attributable to half of the income total, not just a quarter, not just a third of it. And so you'd end up with $25,000 a year, which is $2,083.33 a month. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
But I tricked you. This is a trick. This is not how you do it. All right? So in New York and in many places with a formula like this, there's something called the cap. Okay? The cap. And the cap is the highest amount of combined income that goes into the formula in the first instance, okay? And in New York right now, the cap is $154,000, okay? So so you only apply this formula to the first $154,000 of combined income, okay? So so when we were first looking at it, when it was 150, you didn't hit this number.
Right.
But now that it's 100 and 100, you do hit the number. So the first thing, so instead of calculating the number on $200,000 of combined income, you calculate it on $154,000 of combined income. Okay. All right. But he still makes $100,000, and so does she. So that's what goes into the rest of these numbers, which is why when I said before that you can't just apply the number to his income, you have to go through these steps in case you go over the cap.
So I'm a little bit confused. This calculation has nothing to do with proportion of time that they have?
So this calculation has nothing to do with the proportion of time, except to the extent that, like I said before, unless you have more than half of the time, you can't get anything. So if you have less than half the time, the number is 0. If you have more than half the time, this is how you calculate the number.
But doesn't that seem like it makes no sense? Because in the scenario you set out for us, they had the kids almost the same amount of time. So it's almost like profiting off of having the kids, right? Or the opposite. Let's say that that it was 10, that she had the kids 90% of the time and he had the kids only 10% of the time. She still only gets that amount of money to raise the kids 90% of the time. That feels like really.
So that's a very good point, right? So I said what you do is you start with these numbers. You start with this calculation. You start with taking the combined income to $154,000. And by the way, the 154 goes up every year based on an index to inflation. So it was like 152 last year. It was 148 the year before, right? It keeps going up. But right now, this year, 2020, it's 154,000. So, but once you get that number, the judge then looks at it and says, is this number the right number? And how are they going to make that determination given all these other factors? What are those things? Well, the total actual income matters, right? Because, we're using this $154,000. And by the way, that applies to the vast majority of families, right? The vast majority of families make a combined less than $154,000, but not every family does. So you're going to look and you might add or subtract based on what the, sort of the real number is. What are the kids' needs? Okay. Mm-hmm. What if you have kids who have particular special needs, right? They're maybe really little kids, right? Little kids probably cost a little bit more than maybe older kids, or the vice versa.
I think we're going to find out soon.
Or vice versa. We'll find out soon, right? What if
what
if you're talking about kids with dietary needs, right? What if you're talking, right? And remember, this in New York, the formula is the same no matter where you live, right? But you're going to have very different housing costs. If like a family who lives in Manhattan versus a family who lives in, say, Clinton County, right, which is upstate New York, you're going to have different housing needs, right? You're going to have different housing costs, different housing expenses. So that there are a lot of factors, and another factor is how much time are they spending?
Okay,
right? Because like you said, there's something that feels a little bit unfair to say that because you have 49% of the time and she has 51% of the time. But you're still paying for food during that 50% or 49% of the time,
right?
Almost 50% of the time. You're still paying for the kids to have activities, right? If you have the kids 49% of the time, you have to take them on vacation, right? You have to buy them clothing, okay? You have to do all of these things almost as much, maybe not quite as much, maybe a 2% difference, but almost as much. And if you're talking about a situation like this, where she makes more money than him, right? There's something that feels a little unfair about him paying a substantial portion of his income when he's still going to have all of these expenses.
We had a clarifying question come in. Yeah. So the question was in the first example, but I think we can actually put it through all of the examples we've talked through. Is Paul paying Connie whatever the amount was? And the answer was...
The answer is in New York, like I said, in New York, there is that harsh cutoff at 50%. And I'll tell you something.
So the answer is yes.
The answer is yes. The answer is yes. Paul would be paying Connie under that formula. Now, I'll tell you something. It creates sometimes difficult litigation that doesn't necessarily need to exist. Now, imagine, let's say that you have a situation where Paul makes nothing. Paul is a house husband and he makes nothing. Now, if he's a house husband, why doesn't he have more than 50% of the time? But he's a house husband, right? He makes nothing. And Connie makes $100,000. She's a contractor. She makes 100 or 150 or whatever number you want. She's the breadwinner and he's the stay-at-home dad. Now, you might end up in a situation where the two of them might be able to agree on time sharing, right? Where he, because he says, look, I don't really care. I'm happy to have more weekend and holiday time. You can have more weekday time. And you end up with maybe 51% or 52% or 55%, but my time's better, right? Because I have weekends and holidays, and that's the good stuff, right? You get to see them when they're at school. I get to see them during the weekend. But that creates a problem in New York, because he would then be locking himself out of child support that he might need.
Yeah.
So you end up with a situation where you've got to either negotiate around that, or sometimes you end up with sort of fights over these very tiny fractions of time. And it's a little bit unfortunate, but it's just the way the law works. And there have been cases that judges have tried to sort of talk their way around the rule. And the appeals courts have really uniformly said, no. 50% plus one plus a little bit is 50% plus a little bit, and that's the end of it.
So when you're negotiating this with clients, I am imagining, because I had no idea that this law exists, that people probably wouldn't know. Is this something that comes up a lot when you're sort of trying to, excuse me, work out timing, that you have to say, wait a minute, I know it doesn't seem like it makes a big difference, but that 50% plus has further implications than you can even recognize.
It's something we always have to think about, right?
Yeah.
Whenever we're crafting a settlement agreement, if you're dealing with custody and not dealing with child support, you often have to have, or will often include, something that says, look, even if a judge, because you don't necessarily go through and calculate it, but sometimes what you need to do is you need to say, look, this parent is going to be the primary residential parent, irrespective of how the calendar actually works out.
Okay.
Right? Because you don't want a situation where, because, let's say that by happenstance, right? If I'll put it this way. So if you have a sharing, you have everybody alternates every week, except there's also the holiday swap off. And it just so happens that in a particular year, right, all of my holidays fall, or all of Paul's holidays fall on the weeks that he was going to have anyway. And all of Connie's holidays fall on the weeks that she wouldn't have had.
Right.
So now you have a situation where Connie has more than 50% of the time. Not intentionally, just by happenstance. So you have to work in and make sure that doesn't then end up turning around and blowing up a child support.
Does that happen? Like, has that
it has not happened in my experience, but I know that it's a thing that's happened in
and could that be a sort of nefarious strategic plan to look at, especially I'm thinking things like leap year, and
it creates a lot more complication than it's worth, in my opinion. But the law, that is the law in New York. The law is the law, and judges are going to apply it. They're not going to say, well, I don't care what the law says. So you've got to be careful.
But it is something. So like, if this year, if that happened, could you then say, oh, look, this year we triggered, and now
you can
now because I have 51% because of leap year. Now suddenly you owe me child support.
Or at the very least, I don't owe you any.
Or I don't owe you.
Right? At the I can't be forced to pay because I know. And look, it comes up more often in cases where there's really been a change, right? Let's say there's been a real change, right? It was a 66-33 schedule, but then Paul, something happened with Paul, and so now Connie is taking the kids much more often. And suddenly she's now got the majority, right? She might then go in that case to the court and say, hey, there's been a real change. I haven't ever seen it in the context of like a settlement agreement where like that thing, but it could, right? That's what the law says. And you've got to be, whenever you're talking about what the law says, and given how clear it is, you've always got to be careful.
Yeah. There's a comment that's come in that's sort of, somewhat what I've been thinking about too when it comes to custody, child support. I feel like culturally, or in what I usually hear, is someone saying they get screwed over for child support, or screwed over for one way or the other. So like, the question is, where were you 17 years ago? But like, how can someone avoid that? How can they avoid feeling like they got screwed over in child support? What are some tips?
Well, look, the thing that's most important, and the thing that is most important, right? So you start with this formula, right? Like I said, you start with the formula. That's the starting point. But the thing that's most important in whether you're going to go away from that formula, either by including more income, right? Remember I said the cap was 154. Judges can go over that.
Oh, okay.
Or just giving you a higher number despite what the income is the child's reasonable needs, right? What does that mean? What are reasonable needs, right? You don't necessarily know. It's going to be different in every case. But let's say that you have a kid who goes to a special school, right? Because they have, again, special needs. And that special school is in an expensive neighborhood, right? That child's reasonable needs are going to be higher because you got to pay for housing, right? Or let's just say that you just generally, right? You have a child who's got who's been living a particular lifestyle, right? And has become accustomed to a particular lifestyle. And it's not that, oh, well, now that they've had it before, they get it forever. That's not what I mean. But, you know, if they're a kid who has been used to, for example, participating in particular activities, having particular kinds of travel, right? Living in a particular place or location, right? All of their friends are in, are in the West Village, some of the most expensive residential real estate in the whole world, right? Like that's where all their friends are. That's where their whole life is. Yeah, you could say, well, what does a kid need to live there? A kid can very easily live perfectly. A lot of perfectly happy, very well-adjusted kids who live in Clinton County, and they live in very nice houses in lovely place up in Clinton County. And I keep using Clinton County just because it's what occurred to me to begin with, right? It's obviously not the there's nothing particular to it, but but a judge is not going to buy, oh, this is a kid who has lived and worked and at school and had their whole lives here in the West Village, but I'm only going to order you to pay her something that will let her live in the Clinton County, right? So those are the things, and so when you're, to get back to your question, when you're thinking about, okay, I don't want to get screwed, right? Really sit down and think about at the beginning of a case, okay, what are this kid's needs? What are his or her needs or their needs? And what do those cost? How much have I been spending? And, sometimes you have a lot of cases where, or I do anyway, and I'm sure every family is a little bit different in this regard. But that, I put money on a credit card, right? I didn't necessarily pay the credit card or think about it. I bought groceries on the credit card, or I spent whatever I spent, and I never really thought about the elements of that budget. So it's, it's some number. It's a lot, or it's not a lot, or we were thoughtful, but we weren't thoughtful.
When you say elements of the budget, do you mean specifically the elements of the budget that are spent on specifically on kids?
Sure. Yeah. But remember, there are a lot of expenses that you can't necessarily pull out that way. Right. And that's frankly what we're talking about here when we're talking about a child support, right? Like
little Jimmy had one banana.
So let me use this as an opportunity. Let me use this as an opportunity to sort of zoom out a little bit. When we talk about child support, we're talking about two things. Okay. We're talking about direct support, which is the number that the check that gets written every month and paid every month, or deposit, the direct deposit, whatever it is. And though that direct support is supposed to go for the things that you can't necessarily itemize, that they're kind of hard to just sort of disaggregate from all the rest of your spending: housing, food, clothing, activities. When I say activities, like going to the movies, going to the ice skating rink, that kind of stuff, right? You don't want to have to, in your life, go through your life and say, okay, every time I buy I bought 20 chicken nuggets from McDonald's. He ate 6 of them and I ate 14 of them. So let me take out 14 and apply 6, and then I'm going to write a receipt and I'm going to add, no, those kind of things, those kind of everyday general purchases and general things to live, right? That you're going to get a check every month. And that's what we're talking about. And then the second thing we're talking about are what's called add-ons. Okay. Add-ons, private school tuition, right? Extracurricular activities, religious instruction, unreimbursed medical expenses, right? Those sorts of things. You could say insurance probably also falls into this category, depending on who's paying it, depending on how you're doing it. But medical insurance, those sorts of things, which are like specific, itemized things that are just for the kid, and that you can easily pull out and say, okay, rather than you giving me a check and then me paying for this thing, you're just going to pay for it, or I'll pay for it and then you'll reimburse me. But there's no sense in like figuring out what's the monthly on private school, right? What's the monthly on unreimbursed medical expenses? No. You just pay for those things separately, and they're looked at separately and they're pulled out separately. So when you're figuring out what is a settlement that I'm going to do, or what am I going to ask the judge, right? Think about this bucket. Think about the direct expenses bucket. The food, the clothing, the housing. Housing is obviously the biggest one. most of the time, depending on where you live, right? What is it that this child or these children really need that I need to make sure that I'm able to cover? And how am I going to cover it? I'm going to cover it with my income, and I'm going to cover it with the child support that I'm getting. And really think about that, and make sure that before you go and make any sort of an agreement, that you have a real good sense for yourself of what those numbers look like. Because sometimes I think, sometimes they're overestimated, sometimes they're underestimated, but I'm not sure that people necessarily have a good sense, right? Because again, you go to the grocery store and you buy groceries, right? You buy groceries and you know what your grocery bill is maybe, but you don't necessarily know, okay, what portion of that am I spending on the kids versus on myself versus on my spouse or the parent of my children who I'm not with anymore.
Yeah. Thank you. That was good advice, I think. I hope
so.
Another question came in, and it's again sort of something that's been in the back of my mind. The example that you gave, the parent who makes less money but also had a tiny bit of less time was potentially going to be ordered to pay child support.
Mm-hmm.
And that still feels, there's something about that still feels like unfair. Can you talk a little bit more about like what you ran it through the formula, and that's why we came up in that way. But then you said that's sort of just a starting point, that they would look at all of these other things. Can you talk a little bit about when parents make very dramatically different amounts of money, how that fits together?
So in reality, in my experience, if you have one parent who makes dramatically more money, it is very unlikely that the other parent is going to be ordered to contribute to pay direct support. Or more than a token amount. I mean, there's a minimum amount, technically $25 a month you have to pay, but like I said, that's basically a nominal amount.
So can you say that one more time? So if the parent who makes less amount of money very rarely would have to.
Again, it depends when you say less. You're saying dramatically. Let's say that you have the parent with 51% of the time or 75% of the time, whatever it is a trust fund child who makes $5 million a year in income, and the parent who has less time is a teacher who's making $50,000 a year, right? A court is not going to order the parent who's making $50,000 a year to pay more than a token amount to a parent who's making $1 million a year. When we're talking about the direct support, because this parent has to be able to live too. This parent has to be able to provide housing for the children with them too. And you're never, as a judge is not going to say, well, too bad, you can, too bad, go live in a hovel and the children will never want to be with you and that sort of thing. It's not going to work like that. Judges are in these things practical.
It's good to know.
But they will be asked to contribute to things like add-ons, and that's going to be proportional to their income. So you're going to do the same little calculation, and maybe it's 90-10, maybe it's 85-15. But for example, unreimbursed medical expenses, right? There's going to be a burden on both parents. Now, if you're settling a case, remember, you're going to settle a case for an amount that somebody's going to want to accept. And if you tell a parent who's making $50,000, right? Well, there's only going to be a settlement if you're paying 17 or 25% of your income to the parent who's making a lot more. That's not going to fly, right? You're not going to accept it because it feels unfair, and it is unfair, and it imposes an unfair burden. So there's a practicality to it that you have to consider. But again, the starting point, if you're going to a judge and you're having that fight in front of a judge in a trial, the starting point is always going to be the formula, the guidelines.
Wow, really interesting. I know we're talking just about New York State, but how would others find what the formula is in their state? Is that something that they can find online?
It usually is if their state has a formula, and most of the ones that I'm aware of have some sort of a formula, whether they're this specific or not. Usually you can frankly go online and Google it. There's a lawyer out there who's going to have it. It's usually embedded in a statute. So you can go out, you can find it. And if you can't find anything, you can usually call a lawyer and just say, hey, I'm just looking for some information. Is there any, can you direct my attention anywhere? And there'll usually be some sort of a resource. And in a lot of states also, like, look, in New York, the reason that these formulas were put into place were to make things simpler for people who can't necessarily afford representation, right? Or who can't necessarily afford to pay a lot for a lawyer. So you want to keep things simpler and more straightforward. And to be able to say to somebody, look, here's where your starting point is. And now we can fight about it, maybe get you a little more, or fight about it, maybe have you pay a little less. But here's a good notion of where you're starting. You're not starting from like, oh, well, it's whatever. So depending on the state you're in, usually that's the purpose of it. So if you can find that information, it will give you a good guide to sort of moving forward and balancing your expectations.
We have another question regarding some vocabulary review. Can you review what direct support was again,
Sure.
what the other thing that's not direct support was again, and then how that differs from spousal support?
Okay. So what we're talking about now is child support, right? Child support is what it sounds like. Support that's designed to support, that your obligation as a parent to support your child even when they're not living with you, right? Spousal support, and we'll deal with that part of the question first, is what it sounds like. It's support for your ex-spouse to make sure that person can continue to live after you're no longer in an economic union.
And it's also known as alimony, right?
Also known as alimony, also known as maintenance, just depending on where you are.
And we haven't talked about
alimony is the more famous term, but in New York, and I think many places, they're moving away from that term to spousal support or maintenance.
And we haven't talked about that at all today. So the calculations we've talked about have been just on child support, not at all.
Just on child support. We've just talked about child support. Now, and look, the big difference between child support and spousal support is that in spousal support, you only get if you were married, and child support you only get if there were children, right? There's no child support if there's no children, and there's no spousal support if you weren't married. Now, look, some states, California in particular, you can get what's sort of a form of spousal support, even if you weren't married, called palimony. There is no palimony in New York. There is no palimony in most states that I am aware of, but it just depends on the state you're in. But in New York, very strict. If you weren't married, you don't get spousal support. Okay, so now we're breaking down, again, going back to the vocabulary. So there's two aspects to child support. The first is called direct support, and that's, again, the check that everybody thinks about, right? Oh man, to my stupid ex-wife, I got to write a check, a spousal support, or excuse me, child support check of I got to pay $5,000 a month in child support or whatever.
And that's what this formula is for direct child
That's what
support.
this formula is. And direct support is supposed to cover housing, food, clothing, day-to-day needs like toiletries, and the more sort of day-to-day activities like going to the movies, those sorts of things, and travel, right? So the things that you're not necessarily breaking out that are just kind of like as a parent, my expenses, my monthly expenses are a certain amount higher than they would be because I've got a child, and that's what the direct support's for. Okay. Then, so that's one side. Then there's add-ons. And the add-ons are the big add-ons are private school tuition, unreimbursed medical expenses, extracurriculars, and religious instruction. Okay, those are kind of the big ones that you think about. And those, like I said, those are going to be separate from that. You're not supposed to use the direct support payment to cover those. They're supposed to be sort of separate from other portions of your income, or you can if you want, if you're getting it. But each of you will be ordered to pay a percentage of those things. So you'll be ordered to pay, and that'll be in proportion to your income. But that's going to be over and above the direct support payment that you're getting every month, or that you're paying every month, right? Because it's not like, oh, well, I paid my direct, so why should I have to pay for private school tuition? Or why should I have to pay for these unreimbursed medical expenses? That should come out of there. That's not how it works. It's separated.
Okay, great. I'm looking to see if there are any other questions that have come in that we haven't yet Oh, yes. What about child care? Parent paying for child care?
Thank you, whoever asked that question. I'm sorry I forgot that. So in New York, and it's similar in other states and different in some states. In New York, you are entitled, child care is an add-on, the same way that private school is an add-on, the same way that unreimbursed medical expenses are an add-on. Child care is an add-on, but child care is only an add-on if you are under the statute, right? So the strict statute, if you are working, looking for work, or in school full-time in order to eventually hopefully work, right? So it's not just, well, I'd like a babysitter on the weekends because I want to go out with my friends.
If it is a baby, if you are looking to pay a babysitter, that comes out of
that would come out of direct support.
Direct support,
right?
Okay.
But if you are in school, right? Let's say that you're studying to be an architect, right? And you have to go to school, right? You need childcare when that's going on. You would get, in proportion to your income, that thing. And the notion behind that, right, is we want to encourage people who have children and are now single parents to be able to go and work, because we want them to be able to contribute to the support. And it's not fair to say, well, we're going to reduce what you're getting from the other parent because you can make money, but we're not then going to offset the amount you have to pay in order to do that, right? In order to work, right? Or to go to school, career, right? Like if I'm going to say, well, your income is $100,000 a year because you're a contractor, right? But also now you've got to pay for childcare. To do that, we've got to make that even. We've got to even that out. Now, that said, I have had cases, and I have cases where, because of the particular circumstances, or because there's an agreement or whatever, right, a parent who doesn't work might get some money for childcare. But those are the exceptions rather than the rules.
Great.
But that was a very good question. Thank you, whoever asked that.
Good question. Any other questions while we wait and see if there are any other questions? What should people do if they have questions that they don't feel comfortable sharing on the Facebook Live, or come up, later tonight, or have future topic ideas? So
if you have any future topic ideas or any questions that you didn't feel comfortable asking on Facebook Live, we have an email address, unhitchinghour@gmail.com. You can reach us there. We'll go check it out. We'd love suggestions for future topics. You can also, maybe if you missed part of this episode, go to our YouTube channel. Like I said, go like and subscribe on there. And I hope that you go check those things out, because maybe some of the answers will be in those videos.
Yeah. So I think that's it, unless you have anything.
No, that was it. So with that, I think we'll call this episode to a close. We're going to continue talking about child support a little bit more next week, in next week's episode. Same time, same bat time, same bat channel.
Who are you?
I am Reed Aronson. I am a divorce lawyer here in Manhattan.
And I'm Vanessa Aronson. I'm his wife.
And this has been the Unhitching Hour, how the law works when your relationship doesn't. Thanks so much for joining us. See you next week. Bye.